Behold, for it is time to return to the tales of Kleinnak. I am, of course, your author, Nate, and we're off on the third chapter of the Adventures of Harry Potter Year 1. I'm hoping to have more confidence this week to really try out voices and such. I think, there was a time when I did plays and acting was my life. Yeah, so much confidence ruined over the years. But that's why I'm here, to try and build that up again. Some exciting life news. Finally starting to get some nibbles of interest in the job market, which is good. Holy cow, not kidding. Another one just came in as I was typing this up. Yes, I do read off a little script here to just kind of keep me focused a little bit. Even then I can kind of wander and ramble a little bit. Anyway, and this with substantially increased pay. My money troubles would probably be a little dealt with if I got this job. So everyone, definitely please keep all your fingers crossed for me here. Just waiting to hear back on a time for an interview now. So anyway, moving on. Some other more of my life news, as I mentioned I think I might have mentioned in another podcast. My grandmother has been in the hospital for almost a month now, with some pretty serious brain issues following a car accident. She's just been in for another surgery, but has come out of that apparently really well, and so hopefully she'll finally be on the mend here. It's been a pretty stressful few weeks with that, to say the least. Now getting on to, I guess, the happier stuff. Now, what to say about this week's upcoming chapter? It was the first real big test chapter where there were finally a lot of names that were going to start getting thrown around. And I remember definitely at the time being kind of worried about this seeming kind of daunting to new readers. I wasn't as worried as I probably should have been. I know because part of it at the time was we just weren't taking it that very seriously, and that's something I'll talk about more in the after part. But so it was that's something I was a little worried about, even though of course, as most of the people who, as those of you who've read along with the series know, most of these names really weren't going to feature at all. I remembered myself, my times in high school being a kid, and, I went to a school about 800 students, and I was about the same size as Hogwarts, really. If we go off of one of the metrics I know was in one chapter, and I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but they described there being about 200 Slytherin students during one of the Quidditch matches. And so if we extrapolate from that to about 200 students per house, we get a figure of about 800. So I was more okay with having just lots of names because, you hear lots of names, even though they're people you'll probably never ever speak to. But, it was also a chance to show a bit of a contrast to Harriet and Harry, where Harriet pays a little more attention to those things, and she's a little more curious about, the world around her compared to Harry. So let's see. Extrapolate. Now, as this is another kind of a bigger chapter, not going to have too much of an intro here. We're about to jump right into it. I say longer chapter, but it's just longer than we've seen so far. It's actually about average length as far as AHP chapters go. I have some of them well over twice as long as this one. So, any hoozlebees, let us begin. The Adventures of Harry Potter, Year 1, Chapter 3. Songs, Hats, Sortings, and Houses. There is no true key to knowing oneself. There is no map to tell you who you are or where you're going in life. Instead, you must make it yourself. You must look at who you feel you are, how others perceive you, and what your experiences of life have been. Be aware of what was and what is, and that will help you discover what will be. General, retired, Jigme Dorji Wenshuk. Harriet trembled a little as the giant doors opened, feeling unprepared to see anything come bursting through them. She felt like even a dragon wouldn't have surprised her anymore. Fortunately, it wasn't a dragon. Instead, it was one of the more austere-looking people Harriet had ever seen in her life. The woman who greeted them was tall, with raven hair done up in a bun and bright robes of emerald green. She had square glasses perched high on the bridge of her nose that glinted in the light of Hagrid's lamp. Her eyes scanned them all so imperiously that she silenced the entire group of whispering first-years in a way that Harriet would have never thought possible. "Here you are, Professor McGonagall, ma'am. All our new first-years safe and sound," Hagrid said with a bow that, given his height, did not come off as much of a bow. The woman named Professor McGonagall gave him a curt nod of thanks. "Thank you very much, Hagrid. All right, everyone, please follow me." Professor McGonagall turned and walked back into the school. The large cluster of first-years began to move forward, and as she neared the door, Harriet found her gaze being pulled higher and higher until she finally crossed the threshold. She didn't know why, but once she finally took that first step into the school, she felt a slight chill run down her spine. It wasn't a scary feeling. More like she had reached a point of no return, as if, for all the strange and wondrous things she had seen and done since she learned she was a witch, this was finally the moment where indeed nothing in her life would ever be the same again. She gaped, looking around as they entered the castle's giant entrance hall. It could have housed at least several elephants, Harriet thought. There were torches all along the walls, and magnificent tapestries hanging down from a ceiling that was so tall it was indistinct in the dim light. Statues and suits of armor stood in every little niche along the walls, and it all led to a giant set of marble stairs that Harriet assumed led up into the rest of the castle. As they followed Professor McGonagall into the entrance hall, Harriet could hear many loud voices coming from another considerable door to the right. She looked at the set of magnificent oak doors, expecting Professor McGonagall to lead her and the other first-years through them. Instead, Professor McGonagall steered them into a small chamber beside the doors. After they were all herded into the room and crammed together uncomfortably, Professor McGonagall turned and addressed them. "Welcome, all of you, to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The more perceptive of you will have noted that I am Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress." "Oh, I did, Professor!" squeaked an excited voice. Harry looked around to see Hermione with her hand in the air, looking anxious. Professor McGonagall blinked slightly, taken aback at this display of enthusiasm, but didn't otherwise respond, except to turn back to address the students once more. "In a few minutes, you will be shown into the Great Hall, where you will be sorted into your houses. This ceremony is not merely tradition, but it is critical to your life at Hogwarts, as your houses will be your homes and nearly your family while you are here at Hogwarts. You will attend your classes with the other students of your year from your house. You will sleep every night in your house dormitories, and you will no doubt waste many of your precious free hours of free time that should be spent on homework, playing games, and socializing in your house common rooms. The 4 houses are, in alphabetical order, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. I will add that all houses have produced their fair share of great and notable witches and wizards, and no house is greater than any other." At these words, Harriet heard a soft snort behind her, and she and several others turned their heads to see a Malfoy looking up at Professor McGonagall with disbelief written all over his face. His smug look vanished, however, when she turned her imperious gaze on to him with a look of utter disapproval. "Now that all interruptions are over. Also, while you are in your house, you will have the opportunity to win or lose points for your house. Points are awarded for good behavior and excellent performance in lessons and taken away for poor behavior, and are only granted or removed by staff. Please note that school prefects and the head boy and girl, on the other hand, while unable to remove or give points, can give out detentions and other punishments. At the end of the school year, the house that has earned the most points will win the House Cup, the highest award for a house in the school. So I hope you'll all apply yourselves thoroughly while you are in attendance and do credit to whichever house into which you are sorted. I will now go and prepare the Great Hall for your entrance. Please take these remaining few minutes to straighten yourselves out as best you can, ensuring you all look your best when you present yourselves before the school to be sorted." She said this last part somewhat stiffly, and her keen eyes darted about, landing notably on Neville, whose robes had been spun around sideways in the jostling of getting into the room, and Ronnie, who still had a smudge of dirt on her nose. Harriet quickly started combing her fingers through her hair frantically. and Ronnie started rubbing her nose vigorously before Professor McGonagall asked them all to remain quiet until she returned and entered the noisy hall, leaving them alone. Harriet swallowed, looking around. "So, does anyone know how we are sorted into houses?" Ronnie shrugged. "Not a clue. Not even Charlie would ever tell me how. It's all secret by tradition and all that. Fred and George tried to tell me it was some test or other. Fred kept trying to tell me he had to wrestle a troll, but like I'd believe anything he'd say about it," Ronnie said with an air of defiance. But Harriet noted how Ronnie seemed somewhat paler than she had been on the train. "You mean you don't know?" drawled the now easily recognizable voice of Draco Malfoy behind them. "I mean, of course someone dragged up by muggles like Potter wouldn't know, but you, Weasley. I would think you would know enough about our ways, even if your muggle-letting father—" "Oh, shove off, you creep," said a boy with a thick Irish accent. Harriet looked around, expecting to see Kieran again, but it was another boy who had short, sandy-brown hair and blue eyes. A tall black boy next to him nodded in agreement. "Getting uppity, are we?" Malfoy muttered with a smirk, and somehow from nowhere, which was an accomplishment for them, Crabbe and Goyle appeared at Malfoy's shoulders, cracking their knuckles menacingly. The other two boys merely raised their eyebrows, but before Crabbe, Goyle, or anyone could do anything more, several gasps and squeals sounded off from the back of the room. At the sound, Harriet looked back and squeaked in shock. Nearly 20 pearly white figures had just appeared straight out of the wall behind them. They were translucent and of all shapes and sizes. They all seemed to be talking to each other, though Harriet couldn't make out what they were saying over all the noise of the other surprised students, who were trying to part before the oncoming figures. Remembering something Ronnie had said on the train, Harriet guessed that these were the school ghosts. One of them took notice of the first years as he floated past, and paused long enough to introduce himself. He was tall and dressed in ancient clothes, looking somewhat like pictures Harriet'd seen of Shakespeare in her schoolbooks. "Oh, hello there! Waiting to be sorted, are we?" Harriet looked around the room with the other students before they all nodded at the ghost, who smiled at them warmly. "Wonderful! I am Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Polpington, the house ghost of Gryffindor House. Hope to see plenty of you there," he said, and without another word he disappeared after the other ghost through the wall with the door that Professor McGonagall had left through. Harriet and Ronnie both looked at each other and gave little shudders. "Well, that was pretty cool. Creepy, but cool," Ronnie muttered, and Harriet nodded in agreement. Finally, the door opened again, and Professor McGonagall re-entered the room. "The ceremony is ready. Form a line, please, and slowly make your way into the Great Hall." Harriet felt rooted to her spot, but somehow she managed to make her way into line behind the sandy-haired boy who had talked back to Malfoy and in front of Ronnie. They filed out after Professor McGonagall, and Harriet gasped again as her eyes took in the Great Hall. It was perhaps the most fantastic room Harriet had ever seen. It was even more massive than the entrance hall, with 4 long tables filled with other students in robes. Banners of scarlet and gold, canary yellow and black, blue and bronze, and green and silver hung over the tables. Harriet assumed these were the colors of each house, with 1 house per table. At the head of the room was another long table, raised above the others, with a row of adults. Harriet guessed these were the teachers. She looked up higher and realized floating candles lighted the entire room. Even higher, Harriet's eyes widened as the room appeared to have no ceiling, just the inky night sky. "Is that—" she whispered under her breath, trailing off as she heard Hermione, a couple people in front of her, whispering to the sandy-haired boy about how it wasn't the real sky, merely a charm that made it look that way. Harriet bit her lip looking at it again. There was more to magic than simple tricks like pulling rabbits out of hats or pulling coins from behind people's ears. She snapped her attention back to the rest of the room as Professor McGonagall stepped in front of them, carrying a stool and an ancient-looking hat. It looked as though it had been torn apart several times and sewn and patched back together, but not before being tossed into several mud holes. Professor McGonagall set down the stool and placed the hat upon it. Harriet was just on the verge of thinking that maybe they would, in fact, have to do something like pull a rabbit out of it, when the hat unmistakably began to sing. Harriet could tell it was the hat singing, not because the sound was coming directly from it, but the hat itself was moving, and a rip near the brim had opened into what could only be described as a mouth. "Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hats sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the Sorting Hat can't see, so try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, for those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. A sharp wave of applause shook the hall as the hat finished singing. It took unmistakable bows to each table, all of whom were giving it a standing ovation, before falling silent. Harriet felt her whole body unraveling from her tension and worry. All they had to do was put on the hat to be sorted. Harriet wasn't sure she fit into any of the hat's descriptions, but it was at least more manageable than trying a spell she'd never learned or practiced before, or wrestling a troll. Beside her, Ronnie seemed to agree as she heaved a sigh of relief. "I knew Fred was putting me on," Ronnie murmured under her breath. "I am punching him so hard when we—" Ronnie was cut off as Professor McGonagall cleared her throat for silence and pulled out a large scroll. "I shall read off the names. When your name is called, please take a seat on the stool and put on the hat. The hat will announce what house you are in, and once done, please replace the hat on the stool and take your seat at your new house table." Professor McGonagall served them all one more time before she called out the first name. "Abbott Hannah." As Harriet watched, a blonde girl went up to the stool. She put on the hat, and after a brief pause, the hat cheerfully shouted, "Hufflepuff!" The table under the canary yellow and black banners burst into applause as Hannah went and joined them. After Hannah, the next girl, Susan Bones, was also Hufflepuff, though Terry Boot became a Ravenclaw. Finally, Harriet watched a girl named Lavender Brown become the first Gryffindor. The Gryffindors seemed to give the loudest cheers of all, and Fred and George even catcalled a little as Lavender made her way over. Harriet didn't know why, but Gryffindor table looked a lot more welcoming than the other tables. Despite not feeling chivalrous or brave or any of the rest of what the Sorting Hat had said about Gryffindors, she wanted to be a part of that table. "Bulstrode Millicent!" Professor McGonagall's voice snapped Harriet back to the present again. Millicent Bulstrode turned about to be as surly-looking as her name sounded, and sure enough, she became a Slytherin. As she looked at that table, Harriet couldn't help but feel they did not look like her type of people at all. Had he been a wizard, Dudley probably would have fit right in. That was not the table she wanted to join, even with all that she had heard from Hagrid about what Slytherins were like, and how Voldemort had been one. "Fanfaro Pixie!" Harriet raised her eyebrows a little at the odd name, though the girl who strode forward was close to Ronnie in height, with platinum blonde hair, and seemed from first glance to be something like a female Malfoy, brimming with smug confidence. Indeed, without a moment's hesitation, the Sorting Hat called "Slytherin!" and Pixie made her way over to them, beaming. Well, okay, some of them are pretty, but still unpleasant, Harriet thought as she watched Pixie go. "Finnegan Seamus," McGonagall called now, and the boy in front of Harriet, who had stood up to Malfoy in the side room, strode towards the stool. Seamus took much longer than most. It was nearly a minute before the hat finally sorted him into Gryffindor. The next girl seemed to raise the teacher's interest. Dora Flamel seemed slightly more pleasant than Pixie had been. Her smile seemed warmer, though after a couple of minutes the Sorting Hat sent her off to the Slytherin table as well. The staff continued to mutter about her as she went. Dora sat at the end of the table and promptly ignored the other students who were cheering her as she looked back at the other first years yet to be sorted. Harriet sighed, deciding it would probably be better if she made no assumptions about anyone in this crazy new world. Every time she made any generalizations, she was immediately proven wrong. "Granger Hermione!" Hermione now went forward, trembling with excitement as she took the hat from Professor McGonagall and forced it down onto her head herself. This time, the hat took even longer. Stealing a glance at her watch, Harriet noted it took nearly 4 minutes for the hat to send her off to Gryffindor. It was this that finally put the first significant worries in Harriet's head. What if the hat didn't sort her in any house? What if the hat declared she wasn't worthy of any house or being at Hogwarts at all, and she had to go back home? Ito Tomomi became a Ravenclaw, and Harriet couldn't help but notice many of the boys' eyes following her as well. The boy named Neville was called forward now. He tripped on his way to the stool, and he took at least a couple minutes before he was sent to Gryffindor. On the way to the Gryffindor table, Neville forgot to take off the sorting hat, only noticing it when the hat itself cried out, and Neville ashamedly returned it to the stool. After Neville, Makeda Atsuko became a Ravenclaw. At this pronouncement, on top of the regular cheering from the Ravenclaws, came a squeal of delight, and Tomomi Ito ran up. She met Atsuko halfway in an enthusiastic hug, before the two went back to the table, talking rapidly and excitedly to each other in Japanese. "Do foreign students often come here?" Harriet whispered to Ronnie curiously. Ronnie shrugged. "Not that I've heard of," Ronnie whispered back. "Does seem like there's a little more than one would expect, though, yeah?" Now Draco Malfoy was called. He walked forward with a confident swagger that made Harriet feel vaguely nauseous, though the sorting hat had barely even brushed his hair before it cried out, "Slytherin!" Harriet glared at the back of Malfoy's shiny-haired head as he went and joined Crabbe and Goyle at the Slytherin table before Martinez Isabella was called. Harriet felt her heart skip a little as this girl strode forward. She was stunning, and even before she got to the stool, some boys, mostly second and third years, could distinctly be heard catcalling. Harriet couldn't help but notice that Fred and George were amongst them. Indeed, they looked as though they were crossing their fingers she would be in Gryffindor. Harriet felt her face burn a little with unexpected jealousy, remembering how they had tripped over each other trying to help her onto the train. "Hufflepuff!" the sorting hat cried out, and Isabella made her way over to the Hufflepuff table. She walked with a grace that reminded Harriet of ballerinas she had occasionally seen on television back in Privet Drive. Harriet couldn't help but give an eternal "ha!" to Fred and George, who looked slightly crestfallen. Next came Scott McIntyre. As he stepped up to the stool, Harriet noticed that 2 or 3 of the professors whispered to each other as they watched him. With a slight groan of disappointment, Harriet heard the sorting hat declare him a Ravenclaw with very little reluctance. Harriet watched Hagrid lean over and poke his elbow into a chair that Harriet had taken to be empty at first, as if he was nudging someone invisible in the ribs. There was a clattering noise, and Hagrid jumped and reached down to lift a very short wizard back up off the floor, plunking him back down into the seat. The little professor was barely tall enough to be seen over the edge of the table, but Harriet could see he had an ever-suffering expression on his face. Harriet looked back towards the Ravenclaw table and watched Scott sit down next to the 2 Japanese girls. He smiled at the one named Atsuko, and Harriet watched her blush sheepishly, and Tomomi gave her friend a little nudge with her elbow. Harriet didn't blame them. Scott was quite handsome. Next came Miyazaki Sae. Harriet expected her to be sent to Ravenclaw too, but instead she went to Slytherin. Sae gave Atsuko and Tomomi a sad, apologetic look as she made her way to the Slytherin table, and both of whom returned it, though with slightly encouraging smiles on their faces. Finally, Kieran O'Brien was called. Kieran made his way ahead with his walking stick and sat awkwardly on the stool with his stiff leg. The hat again took perhaps a minute or so before "Gryffindor!" was its response, and though Harriet was glad to see at least Kieran in that house she wanted so badly to be in, she did feel a bit sad as the 2 obvious friends were being split up like that. Her feeling of disappointment was compounded by the sad little looks she saw them exchange as Kieran slowly made his way to the Gryffindor table. Immediately after Kieran came a tall, thin, but quite handsome boy named Jeremy Owen, who became another Hufflepuff. Harriet swallowed now as more worries began running through her head. She would be called soon. What if she tripped on her way to the stool? What if she was put in Slytherin and wound up being picked on all the time by Malfoy, who seemed to be Dudley all over again? Pansy Parkinson became a Slytherin, and the 2 Indian twins, Padma and Parvati Patil, became a Ravenclaw and a Gryffindor respectively. Harriet jumped when she heard Professor McGonagall finally call out, "Potter, Harriet!" Her name at first was greeted with complete and utter silence. Then, all at once, more murmuring broke out everywhere. As she took a step forward, she felt her cheeks warm as she heard the wolf whistles and catcalls. She turned her head just enough to see it was Fred and George leading this, both of whom were nearly jumping up and down and chanted excitedly, "We want Potter! We want Potter!" Their chants went a long way towards making some of her feelings of her jealousy over Isabella melt away. She sat on the stool, and Professor McGonagall put the hat on her head. At first, she saw only darkness as it slid down over her eyes before a small voice said, "Interesting. Ah, yes, this is a fascinating case indeed. So much is here. But where should I put you? There's strength in here, young lady. Oh, yes, and courage and talent." The hat's voice came as if it was just a soft whisper in her ear, but it seemed nearly bubbling with excitement, rather like Mr. Ollivander had been when Harriet had been trying wands in his shop. "You're brimming with it. But where would it go best? The intelligence? Ravenclaw, perhaps? No. Is courage your most prominent feature? Yes, it shines very strongly, but you also want to prove yourself, and are willing to work hard to get what you desire. Gryffindor," Harriet thought firmly. "Please, Gryffindor, not Slytherin. Gryffindor." "Gryffindor, eh? Are you—" "Yes. Any house but Slytherin. But if it has to be one, please, Gryffindor." "Any house but Slytherin? You can achieve much greatness in Slytherin, you know. Many great witches in—" "No, Gryffindor, please." "Well, if you are so insistent," the hat whispered disappointedly. "Gryffindor!" The hat shouted the last word, and instantly the Gryffindor table erupted in noise. Harriet barely heard it before she took off the hat and made her way on shaky legs to join them all. Ronnie's older brother, Percy, got up and shook Harriet's hand, while Fred and George were cheering themselves hoarse with excitement. Harriet sat down, but jumped as she realized she'd sat right across from the same ghost who had spoken to them before, Sir Nicholas. Much to Harriet's displeasure, he patted her hand in a complimentary way, which made her entire arm go numb with cold. Shivering a little, Harriet returned her attention to the sorting. The tall, black boy who had talked back to Malfoy was named Dean Thomas, and he also became a Gryffindor. He sat down next to the ghost across from Harriet and gave her a little wink, and Harriet felt her cheeks flush again. Harriet looked back to the other first-years eagerly, covering her mouth with her hands anxiously, knowing that Ronnie would be coming up soon. Ronnie still looked a little green, and so did a boy standing beside her. "Van der Locke, Marcus," Professor McGonagall called. The greenish boy next to Ronnie stepped forward. He sat on the stool and screwed up his face nervously as Professor McGonagall set the sorting hat down on his head. He took a long time as well. Harriet could see his mouth moving as though he was arguing with himself, though Harriet knew now that he was arguing with the sorting hat. Finally, even though the boy wasn't done with his mutterings, the hat bellowed out, "Gryffindor!" Marcus got back to his feet after taking off the hat and slowly made his way over to the Gryffindor table, who welcomed him with more cheers. He sat next to Dean and Seamus, and Harriet gave him a welcoming smile that he returned, looking a little bit less green. Harriet spun her head back to the stool and the hat, watching anxiously, absent-mindedly biting her lip, knowing Ronnie would be next. Finally, Professor McGonagall lifted the parchment again and called, "Weasley Ronald!" Harriet stared blankly, and the rest of the hall fell silent too. Professor McGonagall even looked a little taken aback as slowly Ronnie took sheepish steps forward towards the stool, and a wave of sniggers broke over the hall of students. However, the sniggering died almost instantly as Harriet heard a deep voice clear its throat, and looked up at the staff table where she saw that Professor Dumbledore, who she recognized from her chocolate frog card, was looking out over the students with a disapproving gaze. Indeed, even though Harriet had not been one of the people giggling, she felt a little ashamed too. Now she knew that Ronnie's brothers had indeed been about to call her Ronald, which was quite cruel now that she thought about it, but she felt her sense of connection to Ronnie grow a little stronger. Ronnie gave the hall of students one little red-faced glare before muttering, "It's Ronnie!" just loud enough for everyone to hear before the sorting hat was placed down on her head. Harriet was slightly impressed at how Ronnie had declared that so boldly to the room, and so was a little surprised when the sorting hat loudly declared, "Gryffindor!" Ronnie made her way over to the table, sitting next to Harriet as the Gryffindors cheered her. Harriet had been cheering her loudest, and gave Ronnie a welcoming hug as she sat down. Ronnie blushed as she returned the hug, and blushed more as Fred and George chanted loudly, "Ronnie! Ronnie! Ronnie!" They chanted it with such affection that Harriet felt her displeasure at them melt away. Finally, after Blaise Zabini went into Slytherin, Professor Dumbledore rose to his feet. Silence fell over the great hall at once. Despite Professor Dumbledore's earlier stern look over the laughter at Ronnie's real name, Harriet felt a wave of warmth fill her, seeing the smile that the tall and ancient-looking man now wore. It was as though not a single thing in the world could have made him happier than to be there at that moment greeting them. "Welcome!" While many of the smiling new faces looking at me are expecting a speech, the older faces with grumbling stomachs are much greater in number, and thus their obvious desire for a feast wins out over any inspirational words I may feebly attempt to muster. So, instead, I shall leave you with these simple thoughts. Nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. Professor Dumbledore smiled and bowed to the students, who all applauded him, though Harriet noted very little enthusiasm came from the Slytherin table before he finally sat back down. Harriet turned to Ronnie's older brother, Percy, who was sitting on the other side of her from Ronnie. "He's a little odd, isn't he?" she asked quietly, though she secretly felt a little reverence for the old man for reasons she couldn't place. Percy nodded seriously. "Well, naturally. Who ever heard of a plain genius, after all? You have to be a bit odd, even mad, to reach a level of genius such as Dumbledore's," Percy said with another serious nod. There was a groaning noise, and Harriet turned to look at the doors, expecting to see chefs entering with food. Instead, she nearly jumped out of her seat as she took in a table that, once empty, now stood full of more food than she had ever seen in her entire life. Her stomach groaned looking at it all. She had never been allowed to eat as much as she wanted, of whatever she wanted before. Despite all the sweets she and Ronnie had eaten on the train, Harriet couldn't wait to fill her plate with as much as she could. She filled it with a roast chicken breast and thigh, with peas and carrots, and started eating. Ronnie beside her had taken a bit of everything, even some peppermint humbugs. The 4 new first-year boys sitting across from them, Dean, Seamus, Marcus, and Kieran, gave Ronnie some raised eyebrows and looked slightly impressed. However, 2 of the other new first-year girls, Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, who sat nearby, seemed to have bonded relatively quickly, seemed somewhat less approving. Harriet merely smiled affectionately at her new friend and started eating. It was the best roast chicken she had ever tasted, juicy and hot and filling. The ghost across from Harriet, Sir Nicholas, sighed as he looked at the eating students. Aren't you going to eat, Sir Nicholas?" Harriet asked him, a little concerned. Sir Nicholas somehow seemed to go a little more opaque as he looked at Harriet, and she blushed, realizing she had offended him. Hindsight immediately told her how stupid her question had been. His look softened, however, seeing her expression. "No, Harriet, my dear, alas, I haven't been able to eat for nearly 500 years. Not since my poorly botched execution." "Execution?" Ronnie asked, piping up a little excited. "Yes, I was—" "Wait," Ronnie said even more excitedly. "I know you. You're nearly Headless Nick, aren't you? My brothers told me all about you." Sir Nicholas went even more opaque around the face. "I prefer to answer to Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Polpington, if you don't mind." Ronnie merely shrugged, looking nonplussed. "Sorry," she said. "I've just always really wanted to meet you." Sir Nicholas looked slightly mollified at this and smiled apologetically. "Oh, well, thank you, my dear." "So, how exactly does one become nearly headless?" asked the quiet boy named Marcus. Sir Nicholas huffed a little. With his neck ruffed, Harriet thought he looked rather like an African grouse she had seen in nature programs. "One does so when nearly a dozen blunted axe chops fail to achieve their desired result, and you wind up like this," Sir Nicholas said gruffly and tugged at his ear. Lavender and Parvati shrieked as Sir Nicholas's entire head tipped sideways and was only held by a single piece of flesh. Despite her earlier appetite, Harriet felt somewhat inclined to push her plate away, as did nearly everyone else in the vicinity, except Ronnie. Sir Nicholas smiled at the result and placed his head back with a chuckle. "So, all new first-year Gryffindors, eh? We'll need help in finally winning back the House Cup this year, so I hope you're all ready to put your all into your studies. It's getting so I can barely look the bloody Baron in the face any more, for shame," Sir Nicholas said with a sigh. "The bloody Baron?" asked Kieran with a mixture of wariness and interest. Sir Nicholas nodded over towards the Slytherin table, where Harriet could see another ghost, a horrible one. Not that Sir Nicholas, with his unfortunate failed decapitation, had been all that pleasant, but the bloody Baron was deeply sullen-looking, and covered in chains and silver bloodstains. "How exactly did the Baron get, bloody?" Harriet asked, trying her best to sound casual. Sir Nicholas shrugged. "I'm afraid I don't know. He died long before my time, and I've never bothered to ask." "It is a sensitive question to ask a ghost, after all, even from another ghost," Sir Nicholas explained. Before long, it seemed more or less everyone had finished with dinner, and watching this time, Harriet gasped quietly in amazement as the table and plates emptied themselves, glittering golden again before the trays were refilled with more desserts than even Dudley could have comprehended. Harriet quickly helped herself to some treacle tarts she saw nearby, and casually eavesdropped on other conversations going on around the table. Most people seemed to be talking about their families. Seamus Finnegan and Kieran declared they were both half-bloods, though apparently this was a rather vague term. In Seamus's case, this meant one of his parents, his mother, was a witch, while his father was a muggle. In Kieran's case, both of his parents were magical, but his father was muggle-born like Hermione was, and his mother was half-blood. So apparently the definition of half-blood was a wide one, and meant even Harriet herself was one, as her mother had been a muggle-born. Another was brought up by his grandmother, apparently, and hadn't shown any signs of being magical until he was dropped from a window by his great-uncle at the age of 8, and instead of splatting, he bounced. Neville's family was so pleased they bought him his toad. "Blimey, his family must really love him then," Ronnie muttered ironically in Harriet's ear. Harriet, however, looked at Neville and felt she understood him and his affection even for a toad. Harriet knew that if she had a token of love from her family, she would probably hang on to it forever as well. Marcus explained how he was muggle-born like Hermione was, and had only recently moved to England from Australia with his dad, so he could come to Hogwarts. He didn't go into details why. Sensing it was a sensitive subject, no one pressed him on it. Harriet noticed, too, that Dean and Neville hadn't discussed their parents either. Dean seemed to be the opposite of Marcus, and that it was his dad he wouldn't discuss. Now Ronnie was explaining her family lineage, though Harriet faded in interest at this point, as much of it she had already heard during the train ride, and turned her attention to Hermione and Percy on her other side. Hermione was asking Percy about the content of lessons. "So what will we be starting off with? I would love to do some transfiguration. It sounds so difficult but fascinating." Percy chuckled at this, clearly impressed at Hermione's obvious ambition. Harriet felt slightly relieved to see that Percy was capable of anything resembling laughter. "Oh, they'll start you off pretty small in transfiguration, anxious though you are. You'll be making small things into similar things, such as matches into toothpicks, that sort of thing." Harriet felt her interest waning again and looked back up at the teacher's table. She noted Hagrid immediately. Given his size, it was impossible to notice anyone else first when he was around. He was drinking from his tankard and conversing with a pretty blonde witch. Professor Dumbledore was deep in conversation with Professor McGonagall. Also notable was Professor Quirrell, who she had already met with Hagrid at the Leaky Cauldron. He was quickly identifiable by his large turban. Professor Quirrell was supposedly the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, though he seemed too afraid of even his own shadow to be that good a teacher at that subject from what she'd seen and heard. Harriet's eyes now moved to the next teacher down the row from Professor Quirrell. He was hook-nosed with long, greasy-looking hair and ashen skin. He was dressed in all black robes, and seemed to be one of the most unpleasant people Harriet had ever seen. Suddenly, the unknown professor's eyes darted towards Harriet, and as they did, her forehead seared with pain, seemingly running up and down her scar. Harriet's hand jumped to her forehead and massaged the spot as the pain receded. She looked around sheepishly, but fortunately, no one had noticed. She looked up at Percy again. Excuse me, Percy, but who's that next to Professor Quirrell?" "Oh, you know Professor Quirrell already. Well, that's Professor Snape," Percy said morosely. "I know Professor Quirrell's usually a bit, skittish, but he's right to be trembling if he's talking to Professor Snape. He's the potions master, but really he wants Quirrell's job. Nasty and very biased. He's the head of Slytherin House as well." That last sentence made perfect sense to Harriet as she glanced up at Professor Snape. His gaze never came back to Harriet, and she was glad for it. Finally, Professor Dumbledore stood up, and silence filled the hall again. He beamed around at them all and spread his arms wide in welcome. "And so, now we have stuffed our stomachs with our kitchen's delicious feast, it is time to fill our heads a little with some announcements finally. Students will do well to check the extensive list on our caretaker Argus Filch's door of items not permitted at Hogwarts, and he has reminded me once again to remind you all that magic is not allowed in the corridors between lessons. Not a chance, muttered George to scattered giggles at the Gryffindor table, and even those within earshot at the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables, though Professor Dumbledore seemed oblivious. Quidditch tryouts will start next week, and captains should check with Madam Hooch for scheduling the Quidditch pitch for their teams. First years need to take note that the Forbidden Forest is strictly out of bounds, though some of our older students could do with a reminding of this rule as well. Harriet couldn't help but notice Fred and George chuckling darkly to themselves at this pronouncement, and Percy giving a somewhat disapproving sniff. Fred spotted her looking around at him, and gave her a little roguish wink. And finally, it must be noted that the third-floor corridor to the right is now out of bounds to anyone who does not wish to suffer a most gruesome and violent death. At these words, Harriet felt a little chill. There was no humor in Professor Dumbledore's face or tone as he said this, which Harriet took as meaning he had been earnest. Harriet looked around at the other faces, noted everyone else was taking it very seriously as well. She turned to Percy. Would there really be something in the school that could, kill us? She asked in a worried voice. Percy nodded seriously. Oh, yes. Magic is a mighty thing, after all, though I would have thought he would have at least told us prefects about this at first, or at the very least why that corridor is now off limits. And now, before we part, let us sing the school song, Professor Dumbledore declared. This pronouncement was met with a mixture of resigned eye rolls, jubilant glee, mainly from the likes of Fred and George, and utter confusion from Harriet and the other first-year students. Professor Dumbledore waved his wand, and a golden streamer shot out of it, rising high into the air, forming words. All right, everyone, pick your favorite tune and begin. The school immediately broke into song, though as Harriet listened, she found it impossible to tell what exactly everyone was singing, and just looked at the words. Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hoggy Warty Hogwarts, teach us something, please. Whether we be old and bald or young with scabby knees, our heads could do with filling with some interesting stuff, for now they're bare and full of air, dead flies and bits of fluff. So teach us things worth knowing, bring back what we've forgot. Just do your best, we'll do the rest, and learn until our brains all rot. The tunes the other students sang with range from Irish ditties to low dirges like funeral processions, as Fred and George were doing. While everyone sang, Professor Dumbledore conducted them all with his wand, which was emitting puffs of smoke that formed musical notes as they floated up to the ceiling. After the Weasley twins finally finished, their slow dirge took far longer than everyone else, Professor Dumbledore sniffled and wiped a tear from his eye. Ah, music! A form of art beyond the power of any magic. Harriet turned as a giggling voice from the Hufflepuff table next to them said, You know it! Just loud enough to be heard, and Harriet saw it was Isabella Martinez, the girl who had caught so many of the younger boys' eyes. A wave of giggles swept over the great hall. Even Harriet couldn't help but smile as Professor Dumbledore gave her a warm smile and bow. Yes, indeed. And now it is time for us all to get plenty of sleep in preparation for the beginning of our lessons tomorrow. Good night, Professor Dumbledore said, and Percy sprang to his feet, as did a girl who was wearing a badge with a P on it. First year's on me, he called down the Gryffindor table, and Harriet felt a bit of nervousness again as she got to her feet. The rest of the Gryffindor students headed off, chatting merrily, while Percy led the first years after them, the girl prefect taking up the rear to keep them all together. With every twist and turn, a new wonder washed over Harriet. There were suits of armor that Harriet was quite sure could move and even talk. She could hear quiet, though hollow-sounding whispers coming from them as they walked along, and she could have sworn that some were in different positions when she took her eyes off them and looked back. Even the portraits moved and talked and gossiped about the new students walking through the halls. In a small part of her mind, Harriet wondered at that moment if perhaps the school itself was somehow alive with magic. Percy led them along, pointing out false stairs that they had to jump, though Neville fell in one, slowing them up considerably, giving them guidelines as to when certain staircases would change directions, as they had a penchant for doing. There were also false doors and many locked doors, some of which varied depending on the day. At the last staircase, a bundle of walking sticks was floating in midair. "Peeves," Percy muttered darkly as he spotted them, holding out a hand to halt the first years. "A poltergeist, and a nasty one at that." At those words, one of the walking sticks flung itself at Percy, who whipped his wand out and sent the walking stick flying back at the bundle, though they artfully dodged out of the way. Harriet and a few other students applauded a little at Percy's magic. "Peeves, show yourself," Percy commanded. There was the sound of a raspberry in response, and with a quiet pop, a small man appeared, floating in midair and holding onto the bundle of walking sticks. He suddenly spun in midair, flinging 4 more walking sticks in rapid succession as he did. Percy raised his wand, but this time Kieran stepped forward, pointed the bulb of his shillelagh at the oncoming sticks and yelled, "Protego!" 2 of the 6 sticks seemed to hit an invisible wall and clatter to the stairs, while another looked like it lost trajectory drastically. The 4th sailed straight at Percy, though he deflected it just as easily as the very first one with his wand. Peeves cursed, shaking his fist at Kieran and Percy before vanishing through the wall, the rest of the sticks clattering down too, unable to pass through the wall as Peeves had done. Everyone was looking at Kieran rather impressed too, and he gave a smile to Dean and Seamus, muttering, "Told you I could do a Protego charm with it." Dean and Seamus blanched a little, though Marcus smiled and nodded his approval, while Percy patted Kieran on the shoulder. "Outstanding, O'Brien," Percy said, smiling. "With new students like you, the house cup may just be ours after all. Yes, you all need to keep an eye out for Peeves. He loves pranks, and he was in a towering mood, I'm sure, to be throwing walking sticks at us, probably because the other ghosts wouldn't allow him into the starting feast. You'd think after all these years he'd just give up. Anyway, we're almost there now." They continued following Percy, though with 2 brief pauses farther back in line to help Neville, who tripped over the walking sticks twice. Behind her, she could hear Kieran, Dean, and Seamus all arguing over Kieran's spell. "Well, you didn't stop all the sticks," Dean hissed, with just a hint of jealousy in his voice. "He stopped 2 and slowed 1 down," Marcus piped up. Now the sorting was over, and he had a full stomach. He'd become much more talkative and relaxed than when Harriet had first seen him. Finally, they stopped in front of a portrait of a fat lady in a pink dress. She smiled warmly at them all and asked, "Password?" "Caput Draconis," Percy said in an overly loud voice, so all the first years could hear. Harriet concentrated hard on the word, memorizing it. As Percy said it, the portrait swung open like a door, and they all started climbing in through a hole behind it. Dean and Seamus hung back to help Neville through, but soon they were all in a large and very comfortable-looking common room with a warm fire going in the fireplace and soft, squishy armchairs and couches, all of which seemed full of older students who were all chatting and catching up after a summer apart. Percy then divided them up, boys going to one spiral staircase and girls to another. Harriet followed Hermione, Ronnie, Lavender, and Parvati into a dorm room marked first years. Inside the room were 5 4-poster beds, each with bright red velvet hangings, side tables with pitchers of water and glasses on them, and their trunks at the feet. Harriet could barely contain her excitement seeing them, and Lavender squealed with delight and leapt onto hers, bouncing on it before sitting up and beaming around the room. "Oh, I've always wanted a bed like this since I was little," she exclaimed, though Ronnie merely shrugged, uninterested, and stretched before flopping onto her bed and closing her eyes. Scabbard spilled out of her jacket pocket with a squeak, rolling down her shoulder onto the bed, where he crawled in a disgruntled way to Ronnie's pillow and flopped down there instead. Parvati and Lavender both turned disapproving eyes on Ronnie before they started changing into their pajamas. Hermione set a muggle photograph of 2 people Harriet assumed were her parents on her bedside table and smiled at them in a slightly sad way before she started changing into her nightshirt. Harriet opened her trunk, getting changed too, and pulled back her covers. The sheets and mattress were soft and warm, and seemed to call to Harriet as she slipped between them. Ronnie was already snoring. Parvati threw a pillow at Ronnie, who snorted and woke up before she glowered and threw it back. She then got up and started getting into her nightclothes as well. So I know we all just heard each other's names at the sorting, but I'm Lavender," Lavender said, wanting to diffuse the situation. "I'm Harriet," Harriet said, nodding, and a hush came over the room again. "Are you really Harriet Potter? I mean, the Harriet Potter?" Parvati asked, her eyes wide with curiosity, as if she'd been brimming to ask, but had just been too polite until Harriet herself broached the subject. "Yeah, I guess so," Harriet said, and without even asking, pulled her hair aside to show the scar. Both Parvati and Lavender gasped with wide eyes. "Wow. You're going to be so popular with boys. I bet even the older boys, too," Lavender said, and Parvati nodded in agreement. "And your hair is so pretty. It's so shiny," Parvati said, smiling. Harriet blushed slightly and ran a hand through it again. No one ever told her that before. All she'd ever heard was Aunt Petunia complaining how it never did anything but hang down like a ruffled curtain. The closest thing to a compliment she'd ever gotten about it was also from Aunt Petunia, who was pleased how it seemed to cover her horrible scar. "Thanks," she muttered softly and smiled self-consciously. Hermione snorted a little from her bed, and Parvati and Lavender shot her disapproving looks. "What?" asked Hermione, nonplussed. "I mean, we just got here. Do you two really have nothing better to talk about than hair and boys?" "Why not?" asked Parvati. "There's some really cute boys, especially in our house." "And what's wrong with liking fashion?" said Lavender defensively to Hermione before turning back to Parvati. "Though Hufflepuff did get that one good-looking boy, Jeremy, I think." "I think Kieran seems quite nice, too, and that boy Marcus looks sweet," said Hermione sheepishly, though she immediately regretted it as both Parvati and Lavender gave long oohs. "No, I mean, they seem nice, like they're both polite and down to earth, and Kieran seems really brave and stands up for people, and Marcus stood up for Kieran, so..." Lavender and Parvati didn't look convinced, but they let the matter drop anyway. "I rather like those twins, the two older ones," said Parvati wistfully. "I like older boys. Boys our age are never interested in girls yet. They seem kind of like wolves, though. I mean, they catcalled nearly all of us," Lavender said. "Even those who didn't get into Gryffindor." "Those wolves, as you called them, are my brothers," said Ronnie irritably from behind the closed curtains of her bed. "Now, if you don't mind, some of us are tired and would really like to sleep," she snarled ominously from out of sight, and Parvati and Lavender fell silent. Harriet sat up and pulled her curtains shut around her before lying back under her covers. She could hear the sound of Parvati, Lavender, and Hermione pulling theirs closed too, all three of them seeming in a huff. Though as to why Hermione seemed upset, Harriet wasn't sure. Harriet was indeed exhausted, she realized as she lay back down. Despite all of the wonderful and exciting things that had happened that day, her eyes refused to stay open, and before long, or perhaps even instantly when her head hit the pillow, Harriet fell asleep.